A doctor was harming his patients. Then AK-9 led investigators to a secret room in the hospital. The hospital halls were unusually quiet that night, the kind of quiet that clung to the air like a thick fog. Nurse Abigail adjusted her clipboard, her footsteps echoing softly as she made her way through the dimly lit corridors. She couldn't shake the unease that had been growing in her chest over the past few weeks. Something wasn't right. Too many patients were slipping away under strange circumstances, patients who should have been on the road to recovery. As she turned the corner toward the intensive care unit, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Harris exiting one of the rooms. His white coat was immaculate, as always, and his calm, almost too calm demeanor unsettled her. His eyes met hers briefly, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something behind his polite smile, something dark. He nodded in her direction and disappeared down the hallway. Abigail's pulse quickened. She had worked in this hospital for nearly a decade, and she had learned to trust her instincts. And right now, every instinct she had was screaming at her that something was terribly wrong. She hurried to the nurse's station and pretended to check patient charts, her mind racing. How had no one else noticed the pattern? How had no one questioned why so many patients who had been stable suddenly coded in the middle of the night? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to see Detective Allen walking in, his presence a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the hospital. His dark suit was slightly wrinkled, and his eyes carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. "Detective," Abigail greeted him with a nervous smile. "I didn't expect to see you here again so soon." Allen offered a tired nod. "I had a feeling I'd be back sooner than I hoped," he said, scanning the hallway. "I need to ask you some questions about Dr. Harris. Do you have a moment?" Abigail hesitated. She knew that whatever she said could have serious consequences, but the weight of her suspicions had become too heavy to carry alone. "Of course," she said, motioning for him to follow her to the break room. Once inside, Allen closed the door behind them and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "I've been looking into the recent deaths here," he began, "and something isn't adding up. All of the patients who died were under Dr. Harris's care. I've checked their charts, and there are inconsistencies, medications administered that don't match the prescribed treatment plans, unexplained changes in their conditions. I need to know if you've noticed anything unusual." Abigail's heart pounded in her chest. She took a deep breath and spoke the words she had been too afraid to say aloud. "I've had my suspicions for a while," she admitted, "but I didn't have any proof. Dr. Harris is, well, he's respected here. People trust him. No one would believe me if I told them I thought something was wrong." Allen nodded slowly. "That's why I'm here. We're not going to rely on suspicion alone. I've brought in someone who can help us get to the bottom of this." He glanced at his watch. "They should be here any minute." As if on cue, the sound of clicking nails on the tile floor echoed down the hallway. Abigail peeked through the window and saw a German shepherd trotting toward them, his black and tan coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A uniformed officer followed closely behind, his hand resting on the dog's harness. "This is Officer Carter and his partner, Rex," Allen explained. "Rex is one of the best K9 units we have. If there's something here we're missing, he'll find it." Abigail watched as Rex sniffed the air, his sharp eyes scanning the hallway with a focused intensity. There was something reassuring about his presence, a quiet strength that made her feel, for the first time in weeks, that maybe they would finally get some answers. "Where do we start?" Carter asked, his voice calm and confident. Allen gestured down the hallway. "Dr. Harris's office. If there's anything there that can give us a clue, Rex will find it." The small group moved down the corridor, their footsteps muffled by the linoleum floor. Rex walked ahead, his nose low to the ground as he sniffed for any scent out of place. Abigail found herself holding her breath, the tension in the air almost suffocating. They reached Dr. Harris's office, and Carter motioned for Rex to begin his search. The dog moved methodically, sniffing every corner, every piece of furniture, his tail wagging slightly as he worked. Abigail watched in silence, her eyes darting between Rex and the closed door behind the desk, a door she had never seen anyone use. Rex paused, his body suddenly tense. His ears perked up, and he let out a low, guttural growl. His eyes locked on the closed door. Carter frowned. "He's picked up on something," he said, moving to the door. He tried the handle, but it was locked. "Do you have a key?" Alan asked Abigail. She shook her head. "No, that's not a door we use. I didn't even know it was functional." Alan exchanged a look with Carter, then pulled out his phone. "I'll call for a locksmith," he said. "We're opening that door." The minutes that followed felt like hours. Abigail paced the hallway, her nerves stretched thin. She could still hear Rex's growl, low and steady. A constant reminder that something was waiting behind that door, something they couldn't yet see. The locksmith arrived, his tools clinking softly as he worked on the lock. Abigail hovered nearby, her eyes darting nervously toward Dr. Harris's office. "What if he comes back?" she whispered. Alan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "If he does, we'll be ready." Finally, there was a soft click, and the door swung open with a groan. Rex surged forward, his nose twitching furiously as he sniffed the air. Abigail stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she peered into the darkened room. It was unlike anything she had expected. The room was small, barely more than a storage closet, but it was filled with equipment she didn't recognize. Medical devices that seemed out of place in a standard hospital setting. On a table in the center of the room lay a stack of patient files, neatly arranged as if waiting to be discovered. Alan picked up one of the files and flipped through it, his brow furrowing. "These aren't normal patient records," he said, his voice grim. "These are detailed accounts of procedures that were never documented in the official hospital records. And they all have one thing in common. They were all performed by Dr. Harris." Abigail's stomach churned as she glanced at the files in Alan's hands. The pages seemed to pulse with a dark energy, each word a damning piece of evidence. Her eyes scanned the top file, Patient 237. The name had been blacked out, but the notes were chillingly detailed. Unauthorized procedures, unexplained drug dosages, and cryptic remarks written in Dr. Harris's meticulous handwriting. Alan continued flipping through the documents, his jaw tightening with every new discovery. "These patients were experimented on," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was running some kind of unauthorized operation right here in the hospital." Abigail could hardly believe what she was hearing. She'd heard rumors about unethical doctors in other places, but never had she imagined that something so sinister could happen in the very hospital where she worked. Under her nose, Rex sniffed deeper into the room, his nose pressing against a shelf at the back wall. He let out a sharp bark, pawing at the floor beneath the shelf. Carter stepped forward, crouching beside Rex. "There's something behind here," Carter said, running his fingers along the edge of the wall. He knocked lightly, his knuckles meeting a hollow sound. "A hidden compartment." Alan motioned for the locksmith to stay close, but Carter took over. With a few hard tugs, the shelf groaned and shifted, revealing a hidden panel. Behind it was a safe embedded into the wall. Abigail's breath caught in her throat again. What else could possibly be hidden in this room? Alan turned to Carter. "We need to open that safe. Whatever's inside might be the key to proving Harris's guilt." The locksmith quickly moved into position, his tools clinking as he worked on the combination lock. The tension in the air was suffocating, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Abigail could feel the sweat on her palms as she watched the man twist and turn his tools with precision. Finally, the safe door swung open with a soft creak. Inside was a single leather-bound journal, worn at the edges and stained with age. Alan carefully pulled it out, his fingers brushing over the cracked leather cover. "What is it?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling. Alan opened the journal and began flipping through the pages, his eyes narrowing with each entry. "It's a personal log," he said, his voice grim. "Detailed accounts of every procedure he performed in secret. Notes on experimental drugs, risky surgeries. And worse," Abigail's eyes widened. "Worse? What do you mean?" Alan pointed to a section near the back of the journal. He was testing on patients without their consent. And according to this Some of those procedures were fatal. The room fell silent. Abigail felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This wasn't just unethical, it was monstrous. These were innocent people who had trusted the hospital to care for them. Instead, they had been used as subjects in some twisted experiment. Carter's voice broke the silence. "We need to take this to the station immediately. This is enough evidence to start a full investigation." Alan nodded, closing the journal and tucking it under his arm. "Agreed. But we need to be careful. If Harris finds out we've discovered this, there's no telling what he might do." Rex barked again, his eyes focused on the hallway outside the office. Abigail turned, her pulse quickening at the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor. "Someone's coming," she whispered. Alan signaled for silence, and they all pressed themselves against the wall, hidden just beyond the doorframe. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside the office. Abigail held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. A shadow passed over the doorway. For a moment, it felt like time had frozen. Then, the footsteps resumed, fading into the distance. Abigail exhaled, her body trembling with relief. "We can't stay here," Alan said. "We need to get out before someone else shows up." Carter nodded, guiding Rex back into the hallway. "Let's move." Quickly, the group hurried down the corridor, their footsteps silent but urgent. Abigail kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting Dr. Harris to appear at any moment. Every shadow, every sound seemed magnified, each one a potential threat. They reached the exit without incident, stepping into the cool night air. Abigail inhaled deeply, trying to steady her nerves. For the first time in hours, she felt a sliver of safety. But that safety was fragile, and she knew it wouldn't last long. Alan turned to Carter. "Take the journal to the lab and have it analyzed. We'll need every piece of evidence documented before we can bring charges against Harris." Carter gave a curt nod, then walked off with Rex, the dog still alert and ready. Alan turned back to Abigail, his expression serious. "You've been brave through all of this," he said. "But we're not out of the woods yet. Harris is going to realize we're onto him, and when he does, he won't go down without a fight." Abigail swallowed hard. "What should I do?" "Go home," Alan said. "Get some rest. But stay alert. If you notice anything unusual, anything at all, call me immediately." Abigail nodded, though she doubted she would get much sleep that night. As she walked to her car, her mind raced with everything that had happened. The hidden room, the files, the journal, it all felt like a surreal nightmare. But it was real, too real. And somewhere out there, Dr. Harris was still walking free. Abigail barely made it through the front door of her apartment before collapsing onto the couch, her body weighed down by the night's events. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, debating whether to call her sister and explain everything. But how could she even begin to describe what she had just witnessed? How could she explain that the doctor so many patients trusted might be responsible for their deaths? Her thoughts were interrupted by a vibration in her hand. Her phone was ringing. She glanced down to see Detective Allen's name on the screen. With a deep breath, she answered. "Abigail, it's me," Alan said, his voice low and serious. "We just finished analyzing the journal. It's worse than we thought." Abigail sat up straight, her pulse quickening. "Worse? How?" "There are detailed logs of at least 20 unauthorized procedures, all performed in that hidden room," Alan explained. "And some of the patients were healthy before they were brought in. Harris was using them as test subjects for experimental treatments, without their knowledge or consent." Abigail felt her stomach twist. "What about the surviving patient? Did you find anything else about her?" Alan paused for a moment. "Yes. Her name is Emily Graves. She was admitted for a routine procedure and ended up in that room. She survived, but barely. According to the journal, Harris injected her with an experimental drug that nearly shut down her organs." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. "Does she know what happened to her?" "She knows something was wrong," Alan said. "But Harris convinced her that it was a medical complication. She never questioned it until now. I've contacted her and she's willing to talk. We're meeting her at the hospital tomorrow. I think her testimony could be the key to taking Harris down." Abigail nodded, even though Alan couldn't see her. "I'll be there." The hospital seemed colder the next day, its sterile walls tinged with an oppressive weight that Abigail hadn't noticed before. Every nurse, every doctor she passed felt like a potential threat, a possible accomplice. Were they all oblivious to what had been happening, or had some of them turned a blind eye? She found Detective Allen and Officer Carter waiting in one of the private meeting rooms, along with Emily Graves. The woman looked pale and nervous, her hands gripping a water bottle like a lifeline. Rex lay calmly at Carter's feet, his eyes watchful. "Emily, this is Abigail," Allen said, motioning toward her. "She's a nurse here and has been helping with the investigation." Abigail offered a warm smile, trying to put Emily at ease. "Hi, Emily. I'm really sorry you went through all of this, but I'm glad you're here. Your story is incredibly important." Emily nodded, her eyes darting around the room. I wasn't sure if I should come," she admitted. "But when Detective Allen told me what you found, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." "You're doing the right thing," Allen assured her. "Just start from the beginning. Tell us what you remember." Emily took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the water bottle in her hands. "It started about a year ago. I came in for a minor procedure, just something routine. Everything seemed fine at first, but after the surgery, I started to feel strange. My body felt heavy, and I couldn't stay awake. When I finally woke up, I wasn't in my hospital room anymore. I was in that hidden room." Abigail leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Do you remember what happened in there?" Emily nodded slowly. "I was strapped to the bed. There were machines everywhere, and Dr. Harris was standing over me. He told me everything was fine, that I had a reaction to the anesthesia, and they moved me to a private area for monitoring. But it didn't feel right. My chest hurt, and I could barely breathe. When I tried to ask questions, he just smiled and told me to rest." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she continued. "I knew something was wrong, but I was too weak to fight. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare." Abigail reached out, placing a comforting hand on Emily's arm. "You're so brave for coming here and telling us this. We believe you." Emily wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. "I tried to forget about it after I was discharged. I told myself it was just a bad experience, but the fear never went away. When Detective Allen called and told me what he found, it all came rushing back." Allen leaned in, his expression serious. "Emily, your testimony could be the evidence we need to put Harris behind bars. Are you willing to make an official statement?" Emily hesitated, her eyes searching Allen's for reassurance. Then, with a resolute nod, she said, "Yes. I want to make sure he never does this to anyone else." "Thank you," Allen said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You're helping us more than you know." Later that evening, Abigail sat in her car outside the hospital, replaying Emily's story in her mind. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but with every answer, new questions arose. How long had Harris been running this operation? And more importantly, how many people had suffered in silence? Her phone buzzed with a text from Allen. "Stay vigilant. Harris will know we're closing in soon. Be careful." Abigail's pulse quickened as she read the message. She glanced around the parking lot, suddenly hyper-aware of her surroundings. The shadows seemed deeper, the air colder. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Determined to stay calm, she started her car and pulled out of the lot, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of a tail. The streets were mostly empty, but the tension in her chest refused to ease. As she turned onto her street, she noticed a black sedan parked a few houses down from her apartment. The engine was off and the windows were tinted too dark to see inside. Abigail's instincts screamed at her to keep driving, but she forced herself to stay rational. Could be nothing, a neighbor's car perhaps. But as she pulled into her driveway, the sedan's headlights flicked on, illuminating the street in an eerie glow. Abigail froze, her hand on the door handle. The car didn't move, didn't follow her into the driveway. It just sat there, idling, its presence an unspoken threat. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Allen. She answered quickly, her voice tight with fear. "Detective, There's a car outside my house. I think someone's watching me. Lock your doors, Alan said immediately. I'm on my way. Don't open the door for anyone. Abigail nodded, her heart racing as she rushed inside and locked every door and window. Her eyes remained glued to the front window, watching the sedan with growing dread. The engine continued to hum, a constant reminder that she was not alone. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car drove off into the night. Abigail stayed glued to her window long after the black sedan disappeared into the darkness, her pulse racing with every imagined shadow and distant sound. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, waiting for Detective Allen to arrive. Every second felt stretched, her mind racing with possibilities. Who had been watching her? Was it Harris himself or someone working for him? The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled her back to reality. She peered through the curtain to see Alan's car pulling into her driveway. Relief flooded through her, but it was quickly tempered by the lingering fear that had taken root in her chest. Alan knocked on the door softly, and Abigail rushed to open it, unlocking the bolt with shaking hands. His eyes immediately scanned the area around her house, his expression tense. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Abigail nodded, though her voice betrayed her nerves. It was a black sedan, just sitting there, watching me. Alan frowned, his jaw tightening. "Did you get a look at the driver?" "No," she said. "The windows were tinted too dark. It just sat there for a few minutes, then drove off when I came inside." Alan ran a hand through his hair, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. This isn't a coincidence. Harris knows we're onto him. He's trying to scare you, or worse, keep you from talking. Abigail's stomach churned. The thought of Harris knowing where she lived sent a cold chill down her spine. "What do we do now?" she asked. Alan's voice was firm, his determination unwavering. "We keep moving forward. He wants us to back off, but that only means we're close to something big. I'll have a patrol car stationed outside your house for the next few days, and we'll monitor any unusual activity. But whatever you do, don't go anywhere alone." Abigail nodded, grateful for his support, but still feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "Do you really think he's capable of hurting me?" Alan's eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "I think he's capable of a lot of things, but that's why we won't give him the chance. You've been brave through all of this, and we're almost there. We'll stop him. Promise." The reassurance helped, but only a little. As Alan left and the patrol car settled into position outside her house, Abigail locked every door and window again, double-checking each one before retreating to her bedroom. Sleep was a distant hope, her mind still replaying the events of the last 24 hours in an endless loop. The next morning, Abigail arrived at the hospital feeling like a ghost of herself. Dark circles hung beneath her eyes, and every glance from a coworker felt suspicious. Were they watching her? Did Harris have allies here who knew what she and Alan had found? She moved through her morning routine on autopilot, her thoughts constantly returning to the hidden room, the journal, and Emily's harrowing story. Every time she passed by Dr. Harris's office, her heart skipped a beat. His door was closed, as always, and the corridor felt colder, almost sinister. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back to reality. It was a text from Alan. "Meeting with the hospital board at noon. We're presenting the evidence. Be ready." Abigail took a deep breath. This was it, the moment they had been building toward. If the board believed them, if they saw the mountain of evidence they had collected, Harris's reign of terror would finally come to an end. But noon felt like a lifetime away. By the time the meeting began, Abigail could feel the tension in the air like an invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. The board members sat in a semicircle, their faces stern and unreadable. Dr. Harris stood at the front of the room, his usual calm smile in place, as though he hadn't a care in the world. Alan stood beside a projector, a thick stack of documents and photos in front of him. His voice was calm but commanding as he began his presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. What I'm about to show you is deeply disturbing, but it's necessary. Over the past few months, A pattern of unexplained patient deaths has emerged at this hospital. All connected to Dr. Harris. Murmurs rippled through the room, and Harris's smile faltered slightly. Abigail watched him closely, her heart pounding in her chest. Alan continued, clicking through a series of slides. This is a detailed log of unauthorized procedures performed in a hidden room in the hospital, all documented in Dr. Harris's personal journal. We have witness testimony from a surviving patient, Emily Graves, who was subjected to one of these procedures without her consent. Gasps echoed around the room. The board members leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the screen as Alan laid out the evidence piece by piece. Photos of the hidden room, scans of the journal entries, and medical records that contradicted the official documentation. All of it painted a damning picture. Dr. Harris was using patients as test subjects for experimental treatments, Alan said, his voice steady but filled with barely contained anger. Some of these procedures were fatal. Others left patients with permanent damage. And all of it was done without their knowledge or consent. The silence that followed was deafening. Abigail's eyes flicked to Dr. Harris, waiting for his reaction. His face was a mask of calm, but there was a flicker of something else. Something dark and dangerous behind his eyes. One of the board members cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly. Dr. Harris, do you have anything to say for yourself? Harris smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. This is a misunderstanding, he said smoothly. Detective Allen has misinterpreted the data. Those procedures were part of a legitimate research study approved by the hospital. I can provide documentation to support that. Allen didn't flinch. You're welcome to provide that documentation, Dr. Harris. But until then, the evidence speaks for itself. And it tells a very different story. The board exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, the chairman spoke. We'll be conducting an internal investigation effective immediately. Dr. Harris, you're hereby suspended until further notice. Security will escort you from the premises. Harris's smile vanished. For the first time, a crack appeared in his calm facade. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice sharp. You'll regret this, but the board wasn't listening. Security guards moved toward him, their expressions grim. Harris cast one final glance at Abigail, his eyes cold and calculating, before turning on his heel and leaving the room. Abigail exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It was over, or at least it felt that way. But deep down, she knew Harris wasn't finished. Not yet. Alan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You did it, he said. This is the beginning of the end for him. Abigail nodded, though a sliver of unease still twisted in her gut. I hope so. Days passed, but the tension in Abigail's chest never eased. Dr. Harris was gone from the hospital, but his shadow lingered in every hallway. The investigation was ongoing, and while Alan assured her that they had enough evidence to convict him, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. Her routine became one of constant vigilance. The patrol car outside her home was a small comfort, but her nerves stayed frayed. Every knock at her door, every unfamiliar face at the hospital sent her pulse racing. She longed for peace, for a return to the normalcy she had once taken for granted. Then one evening, as she was finishing her shift, Abigail's phone buzzed with a message from Alan. We've got him. Arrested an hour ago trying to leave the state. He won't be bothering you anymore. Her knees nearly buckled as relief flooded through her. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, her shoulders relaxed. Harris was finally behind bars. Justice was finally within reach. As she stepped out into the cool night air, a familiar sight greeted her. Rex and Officer Carter were waiting by the patrol car. Rex's tail wagged lazily as Abigail approached. You did it, Rex, she whispered, scratching behind his ears. You found the truth when no one else could. Carter smiled. Rex has a nose for the truth. He always does. Abigail crouched beside the dog, her hand resting on his sturdy frame. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. For the first time in weeks, the world felt right again. The darkness that had loomed over the hospital was gone, swept away by the light of truth and courage. And as Abigail stood under the streetlights, watching Rex trot back to the car, she knew that life would never be the same again. She had faced something far darker than she had ever imagined, and survived. Justice had prevailed, and thanks to Rex, those secrets hidden in the shadows would never hurt anyone again.